So you know a little bit about who I am, I'm told. I'm Craig Hoyle. I grew up in the Exclusive Brethren, and I am now the Chief News Director for the Sunday Star Times. And obviously a lot of things happened between those 2 points. So I'll talk a little bit about what it was like growing up in the Brethren and how I came to leave. And then we'll open it up to questions, because I find that people usually have a lot of questions, so I won't talk for too long. But I didn't realise that my upbringing was different probably until I was 5, when I went to school for the first time. I realised that our family was different when I was about 5, when I started primary school. Up until that point I'd known that there were people out there that we called worldlies, that weren't part of our religious community, but I always thought that the Exclusive Brethren were the majority and the worldlies were the strange ones out there. And the reason for that was our entire life was caught up in this group. But you were born into the Brethren, you went to a Brethren's school later on in life. When I was at primary school, it was still the state system. But you went to church every night of the week, 4 times on Sunday, and your friends, your family, like your entire social networks were in the Exclusive Brethren. And so it was a real shock for me going to a state school. There were only half a dozen other Brethren kids at the school, and that was when I realised that I was the one that was different. And right through my childhood I asked a lot of questions. It's always been one of my defining features, I suppose. Challenging authority and asking not just what, but why. And that didn't go down well in a group like the Exclusive Brethren, as you could imagine, because I wanted to know why we couldn't watch TV, why we couldn't listen to the radio, why we weren't allowed to vote, and then later on, why we weren't allowed to vote, but why the church was out campaigning for the National Party. And a lot of these things didn't make sense to me. And the Brethren had these sayings. We'll do the thinking, you do the doing, was one of them. And if you don't understand it, don't question it. And for someone like me, even as a child, this was such like a red rag to a bull, I suppose, because I had so many questions. And I was always torn between wanting to ask my questions, but knowing that asking them would get me in trouble. And I became aware, the thing in the Brethren was that people who asked questions or people who challenged the narrative often found themselves out of the church pretty quick. And so I'd grown up hearing about my grandpa, who was called George, who had been kicked out of the church pretty much overnight. Had admitted to his wife in a weak moment that he didn't believe in some of the things the church leader was saying, and he came home from work that night with the priests on the doorstep telling him that he was excommunicated. So it moved pretty quickly if they found out that you were challenging the Brethren teachings. And I went through a similar journey. I came out as gay to the priests when I was 18. Not because I thought I needed to come out, but because according to Brethren teachings, being gay was a sin. And the Brethren had a similar pattern of confessions to, I suppose, the Catholics, where to get clear of your sin, or what they saw as sin, you had to confess it, you had to tell it to the priests, and then the priests had to decide whether you would be forgiven or excommunicated, or if they would deal with it in some other way. And so I confessed that I was gay to the priests because I thought that if I could confess the sin, maybe it would go away. And the Brethren had evolved in their thinking a bit by the time this happened, which would have been 2007 or so. Previously they would have taught that gay people were possessed by demons, and instantly excommunicated them. But by the time I came out, they had decided that it was something that people needed help with. So coming from a place of what they saw as compassion, but still a very, very damaging path to send young people down. And so the church, the brethren, spent the better part of a year, I would say, trying to help me change my sexuality, and this was various things that they did to try help me with that. Praying with the priests, and they sent me to various doctors within the brethren. And of course the issue with groups like the brethren is you're taught that the world leader, who's similar to the Pope, they're led by a guy in Sydney at the moment called Bruce Hales, and the brethren teach that everything he says is the word of God being spoken on earth, and so every time he opens his mouth, that's a direct word from God. And so if Bruce Hales made even a suggestion that you should think about something, it wasn't just a suggestion, it wasn't something you should just think about, that was God directly telling you what to do. So when the world leader, or the man of God as we called him, says, hey, I think you should see a doctor to talk about your sexuality, there was no possibility of questioning that or standing up to that and saying, hey, no, I don't want to do that, or no, I don't agree with that. You had to go along with it. One of the consequences of disobeying an order from the man of God was that you could be excommunicated. And that's just not a risk that any 18-year-old would be willing to take. And I make this point because the brethren often say now that I had free will when this happened, and that we all have and yes, that we have free choice. And I think free choice in some of these religious groups is an illusion. Because if you have created an environment where it's almost impossible to say no, or it's impossible to refuse a suggestion, it's not a suggestion, it's an order. And I feel really strongly about that point when the brethren now try and claim that everyone who's in the church is there voluntarily. And so on the back of Bruce Hales, the man of God, telling me that I should see these church doctors, that's exactly what I did. And I had various meetings with various doctors. Most infamously, there was a brethren doctor in Sydney who prescribed me with hormonal suppressant drugs. The idea being that while they were experimenting with trying to find ways of changing sexuality, they could, in the meantime, completely suppress it. And it took a while before I was willing to stop taking those drugs, although I wasn't willing to say why. I lied and told the man of God that I thought I was fixed now, so I didn't need the drugs. That definitely wasn't true. And after that, sort of following that process, I'd been living in Sydney for a while under the man of God's instruction, and I realised that there was no future for me in a group like the Exclusive Brethren. The only way forward would have been to live a lie, and I think that's a challenge that a lot of people in groups like this face, is they know they're not being authentic to who they are and what they believe, but the cost of breaking away from that is incredibly high, and so you say. And for me, it was a case of reaching that point where the cost of staying in outweighed any benefit that came from it as a result. And I had seen what had happened by this point with other people who had been in this situation, who had tried to suppress who they were. And generally what seemed to have happened is that you can suppress yourself. You can suppress your identity, you can keep your thoughts to yourself for a while. But with a lot of these people, they'd got to their 40s to middle age and it had all fallen apart. And I could see that if I went down that route, if I held on until my late 30s or 40s, by that point there would almost certainly be a wife and kids and a house and probably a business and all of these things. And so it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to leave at 19, but I could see that the longer I left it, the worse the collateral damage would be. And so I, after a lot of deliberating, told the priests that I was going to leave. And their response was that I was mentally unwell. They told me, well, the way their logic went was the brethren are the best place on earth to be, and any logical person would want to be in the brethren. Therefore, if you want to leave this community, you're crazy. And this, something like that has a lot of power over you. And these are people that you've been told to obey your whole life, and that the man of God can do no wrong. They used to say there's more chance of the sun not rising than the man of God being wrong. And so when these people start telling you that you're mentally unwell, it's hard to stand up to that. It's hard to say, no, I don't think you're right. And one of the best things I ever did was, I was in Invercargill, went to a GP for a second opinion. Say, hey, the church says I'm crazy, what do you think? And the GP, which I'm very, very grateful for, sort of ran through everything that was happening in my life and then said, well, actually, no, I don't think there's anything wrong with you, and that the emotions you're experiencing are extreme, but they're a normal response to an extreme situation. And I think that was a really important thing for me to hear, is that a lot of people in these situations are going through really extreme emotions. They're beyond what most people experience in the day-to-day. And I think it's really messed up that you get pushed to a point where you're experiencing these extreme emotions, and then the fact that you're having extreme emotions is turned back around on you as proof that you're not being rational, which was exactly what they said to me. And that didn't go down well with the priests. And over the course of a few months, something that was really important to me was that the brethren had quite a strong awareness of how bad it looked for them to be throwing people out. And they were very careful to try and engineer things in such a way that they could say that you left them, they didn't kick you out. And so when I told the priest that I was leaving, I said, I'm leaving your church, but I'm not leaving my family, I'm not leaving my job, I'm not leaving my home. Knowing that the consequence of leaving the church would be to lose all of those things, but I was determined to make a point, I suppose. I wanted to prove that me losing those things was not my choice. It was something that they were forcing onto me. And that was a difficult time, and it took about 6 months to play out. My parents didn't want to be seen to be throwing me out because it looked bad for the church. So as those months progressed, they just made things more and more and more difficult. And it became a battle of wills, I suppose. And ultimately what happened was what I had known would happen all along. They threw me out. And that came about. They waited until I'd gone away for the weekend, and then the day I was in Australia, the day before I flew back to New Zealand, my dad called me and said that I wasn't welcome in their house anymore. and they had emptied all of my belongings, basically cleared my bedroom into a storage unit, and said to pick up the key when I got back to Invercargill. And so that was what happened. And the consequence of excommunication from the Brethren is that every person you've ever known stops talking to you. I would run into my grandma on the street in Invercargill and she wouldn't stop and talk. You'd run into people that you'd grown up with and they'd cross the street to avoid you. Or I ran into my mum at the supermarket and nothing close or familiar. You might get the barest of greetings. And another time I was at the beach with a friend and my family drove past. My parents and 6 siblings, and every single one of them looked the other way. And so the cost that comes with coming out of groups like this is huge. And I was lucky that I had the ability the whole way through this to ask questions and to challenge what was being said. And so for me, a huge part of coming out of the Brethren was unpacking it, asking questions and trying to make some kind of logical sense of what had happened. And a big thing for me was realising that what had happened to me had happened to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other people. And you don't fully understand that when you're in a cult, because when people leave, they just stop talking about them. They remove all trace that they ever existed. So after I left, I was taken out of all the family photos and any records, like the official church records that show who my family is and who their children are and so on. I'm just gone, I don't exist. And so when people just cease to exist like that, it's really hard to keep track of how many people have ceased to exist, because they're not keeping a list of people that have gone. They're just gone as though they were never there in the first place. And so coming out of the Brethren, I became aware how many other people there were that this had happened to. My grandpa, first of all, who I was able to reconnect with, and a whole series of uncles and aunts, most of whom I'd grown up with never hearing about them. I didn't know they existed. I had no idea, not really, that my dad had 2 other siblings, or that my grandpa had 3 other siblings, and so that process of reconnecting with those family was really important to understanding what had happened to me and being able to make some kind of logical sense of it. And realising as well that what had happened to me had been going on for a very, very long time. My grandpa's experiences were almost identical to mine in terms of loss of family and the consequence of speaking out against the church. When I met him after leaving the church, I was the first one of his children or grandchildren that he'd seen for 28 years. And that was the cost that came with leaving a group like this. I was very, very lucky. Not long after I came out of the Brethren in 2009, I was contacted by 60 Minutes at TV3. They were working on a story to do with the Brethren and wanted to know if I would be interviewed. And the outcome of that was they ended up making a short documentary about my story, which was unusual at the time, because often when people come out of groups like this, they are very, very traumatized, and it takes quite a while before they're willing to talk about it. And I was young and perhaps stupid, definitely determined. And so 60 Minutes ran this piece sort of only a couple of months after my excommunication from the Brethren, and that set in motion what has happened in my life since. The team at 60 Minutes asked what I wanted to do with my life and recommended that I became a journalist. And before that point it hadn't, because questioning things was the worst possible thing you could do in the Brethren. And even after I had left, it hadn't occurred to me that there might be a job where I would be paid to ask questions. And 60 Minutes suggested journalism and offered to back me into university, and ultimately that was what happened. And then they gave me a job. So I went from not having ever watched TV before to working in a TV newsroom within the space of about 2 years, which was an eye-opening experience, but not one I've ever regretted. And the other thing that had a huge impact on me, so Sarah Hoyle was the reporter for 60 Minutes, and she and her husband ended up being so moved by my story that they took me in and became adoptive parents. And I think the important thing to know about Sarah here is that she's not religious at all. Neither were her parents, neither were her grandparents. And so this was someone, this had a huge impact on me, seeing someone who had no religion at all in their framework for their humanity. They were, she was sort of the living embodiment of what the Brethren would have called Christian values, and realizing that it was possible to be a person like this, to be a good person without any trace of religion in your life, really shook my belief structure. And Sarah stepped in, and she and her husband stepped in and became those parent figures in my life. And she would write to my mother and tell her how I was doing, and of course she never got a reply. But it was really important for her, and then it became really important to me to make clear to people that coming out of a group like the Brethren didn't mean... They talk about losing your faith as being the worst thing that could happen after coming out of a group like this. And to me, now, losing your faith after coming out of a group like this is the best thing that could happen. But it's tricky to have that conversation with someone who's in that process of coming out. And for me, my views evolved, I would say, over the years after I came out of the Brethren, and part of that was because losing everything was a consequence of coming out of the Brethren, and what you believed was one thing they couldn't take away from you. They couldn't take away what was inside your head, and so those religious beliefs and the associated structures that went with them, they're something that you have to choose to let go of rather than something that's dragged away from you. And so I'm always very cautious, because I have a lot of people who come out of the Brethren now contact me, and I'm very cautious about telling these people what they should believe or what they should abandon, because that's, of course, an individual journey. But it's been a very long time since I had any belief in a deity. It's interesting, I have still a lot of former Brethren who have some kind of religious belief, and trying to find a way of respecting that and acknowledging that while not compromising on what I believe myself is, it's a line to walk. But I have never regretted coming out of the Brethren. I've never regretted asking questions, and as a journalist I continue to ask questions, and that is something that informs my work as a journalist now, is not only the asking of those questions, but also the power that journalists and by extension society have to shine a light on injustice. And so that's one of my biggest motivators now, is drawing attention to what is going on in groups like this, and not just drawing attention to what's going on in those groups, but also demonstrating to people in those groups that there is a life outside, that there is a way forward, and that people on the outside generally are pretty good. And I was astonished. The Brethren had always said that the church was the only place where you would find warmth and compassion and acceptance, and that the world outside was a cold, hard place. And when I left, I found the opposite to be true. And I was convinced then, and I'm still convinced now, that humanity is generally good, and that people are generally good, and that people will go out of their way to help. And that, for me, is one of the things that keeps me going. And I hope it continues to do so.